What made me become what I hate most? My daughter Iris was 14 when her gymnastics coach started sending her text messages that made my stomach turn. I found them by accident when her phone lit up during dinner with a notification that read, "Thinking about you in that purple leotard." She'd grabbed the device so quickly she knocked over her water glass, and the panic in her eyes told me everything I needed to know before I'd even seen the sender's name. Coach Brennan had been training elite gymnasts for 20 years, and every parent at Summit Athletics treated him like royalty because he'd sent 3 girls to Olympic trials. I took Iris's phone while she was sleeping and spent 4 hours reading messages that got progressively worse the further back I scrolled. Brennan had started innocuously 6 months earlier with compliments about her form and flexibility, gradually escalating to comments about her body that no grown man should make about a child. The recent messages were explicitly sexual, detailing what he wanted to do with her after practice when the gym was empty. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone as I screenshotted everything and emailed the evidence to myself before Iris woke up. The police detective who took my report was a woman named Okafor who'd worked sex crimes for 12 years. She looked at the screenshots with an expression that suggested she'd seen this pattern before, explaining that grooming cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because defense attorneys painted the victims as willing participants or attention seekers. She said Brennan would likely claim the messages were taken out of context or that Iris had initiated the conversations. The investigation would take months, and even with clear evidence, conviction rates for this type of case were discouragingly low. I pulled Iris from Summit Athletics immediately, but the damage was already extensive. She'd been conditioned over 6 months to view Brennan's attention as special recognition of her talent rather than predatory behavior. When I confronted her about the messages, she defended him initially, insisting I didn't understand their relationship and that he was helping her reach her potential. The grooming had been so effective that she couldn't see herself as a victim, only as someone whose private connection with her coach had been violated by my intrusion. Detective Okafor interviewed Iris at the Child Advocacy Center with a forensic specialist present. The interview was recorded, and I watched from behind one-way glass as my daughter struggled to articulate what had happened while maintaining that Brennan had never touched her inappropriately. He'd been too smart for that, keeping the abuse confined to messages and comments that could be interpreted as coaching feedback by anyone who wasn't paying attention. The specialist explained afterward that this was textbook grooming, establishing trust and emotional dependency before escalating to physical contact. Summit Athletics suspended Brennan pending investigation, but within days, a group of parents whose daughters trained with him started a petition demanding his reinstatement. They argued that messages could be misinterpreted, and that destroying a decorated coach's career over text conversations was an overreaction. Several parents contacted me directly, suggesting that maybe Iris had developed an inappropriate crush and was reading too much into normal coach-athlete communication. The victim blaming was so immediate and coordinated, it felt rehearsed. I attended a parents' meeting at the gym where Brennan's supporters presented their case for bringing him back. A woman named Constance, whose daughter had made Olympic trials, stood up and declared that Brennan had never shown anything but professional behavior in 20 years, and that teenage girls often developed crushes on authority figures. She looked directly at me while saying some parents couldn't handle their daughters growing up and blamed others for normal adolescent feelings. 15 people applauded her statement. The investigation dragged on for 3 months, while Brennan remained suspended with pay. During that time, 3 more families came forward with similar complaints about inappropriate messages their daughters had received. Detective Okafor explained that the pattern strengthened the case significantly, but Brennan's attorney, a man named Gelman, who specialized in defending accused predators, was already building a defense around the coach's stellar reputation and the girl's supposed misinterpretation of friendly mentorship. Iris started self-harming in October, cutting her thighs where the marks wouldn't show in regular clothes. I found the razor blade wrapped in tissue in her bathroom trash and spent 2 hours in the emergency room while a psychiatric resident evaluated whether she was an immediate danger to herself. The resident asked routine questions about depression and suicidal ideation while I explained about the grooming and investigation. He prescribed antidepressants and recommended weekly therapy, adding that trauma from sexual abuse often manifested in self-destructive behavior years before victims could fully process what happened to them. The district attorney's office assigned a prosecutor named Levinson, who met with me to discuss the case's viability. He was blunt about the challenges. No physical contact had occurred, the messages could be interpreted as overly friendly rather than predatory, and juries were often skeptical of teenage girls' testimony in cases involving respected community figures. He said they'd move forward with charges but wanted me to understand that conviction was far from guaranteed. His pessimism felt like a preview of the justice system's failure. Brennan was charged with 4 counts of online solicitation of a minor in December. His arraignment lasted 15 minutes, and he pleaded not guilty with Gelman standing beside him radiating confidence. Brennan was released on $20,000 bail posted by his wife within hours. I watched him walk out of the courthouse, surrounded by supportive parents from Summit Athletics who'd come to show solidarity. Several of them glared at me like I was the criminal for destroying an innocent man's reputation. The preliminary hearing revealed Gelman's defense strategy. He presented evidence that Iris had initiated some conversations, asking Brennan for extra coaching and sending him photos of herself practicing at home. Gelman argued this demonstrated willing participation in their relationship rather than victimization. He never mentioned that 14-year-olds cannot consent to sexual relationships with adults, or that grooming specifically involves making victims feel complicit in their own abuse. The judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial but seemed skeptical about the prosecution's chances. I hired a private investigator named Crawford, who specialized in background checks on people with access to children. His research into Brennan's history uncovered a pattern that Detective Okafor's official investigation had missed. Brennan had left 2 previous coaching positions under circumstances that involved unspecified complaints about his behavior with female athletes. Both gyms had quietly let him go without filing formal reports, prioritizing their reputations over warning other facilities about potential danger. He'd simply moved to new cities and continued coaching with no red flags in his background check. Crawford found a woman named Delilah in Colorado who'd been coached by Brennan 15 years earlier when she was 13. She'd never reported what happened because her parents hadn't believed her when she tried telling them about inappropriate touching during private training sessions. Brennan had convinced them she was acting out for attention because she was jealous of teammates getting more recognition. Delilah was now 28 and willing to testify if it would prevent him from destroying other girls the way he'd destroyed her confidence and trust. Prosecutor Levinson was cautiously optimistic about Delilah's testimony establishing a pattern, but warned that defense attorneys typically attacked prior accusers' credibility by questioning why they waited years to come forward. Gelman would paint Delilah as someone seeking attention or settlement money, and juries often found delayed reporting suspicious despite understanding trauma's impact on disclosure. The legal system was designed in ways that protected predators through technicalities and victim-blaming tactics that defense attorneys had perfected over decades. Iris's therapy sessions revealed the full extent of Brennan's psychological manipulation. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Kalani, who specialized in adolescent trauma, explained that Brennan had systematically isolated Iris from teammates by convincing her their special relationship would make others jealous. He'd created artificial scarcity around his attention, making her feel uniquely chosen and desperate to maintain his approval. The grooming had been so sophisticated that Iris still struggled to view herself as a victim rather than a willing participant in something she should have recognized as wrong. The trial date was set for April, 5 months after the initial charges. During that time, Summit Athletics quietly settled a civil lawsuit with 2 of the other families whose daughters had received inappropriate messages. The settlement included non-disclosure agreements and no admission of wrongdoing, effectively silencing 2 witnesses who could have strengthened the criminal case. Gelman had maneuvered the civil settlement specifically to reduce available testimony against his client, a tactic Crawford explained was common in defending serial predators. I spent weeks preparing for trial, meeting with Levinson to review testimony and anticipate defense strategies. He coached me on staying calm during cross-examination, when Gelman would inevitably suggest I was an overprotective parent who'd misinterpreted normal coaching behavior. Levinson explained that my credibility was crucial because the case ultimately rested on whether jurors believed Brennan's messages were grooming or just inappropriate friendliness. The distinction mattered enormously in legal terms, even though morally there was no ambiguity about a 40-year-old man sexualizing teenage athletes. Jury selection revealed how difficult conviction would be. Gelman systematically eliminated anyone who'd experienced sexual abuse or had strong opinions about protecting children from predators. The final jury was 8 men and 4 women, mostly older, several who'd expressed skepticism during voir dire about teenage girls' reliability as witnesses. Levinson tried challenging the composition, but the judge ruled that Gelman's eliminations were within acceptable parameters. We were going to trial with a jury predisposed to doubt teenage victims and trust respected authority figures. Levinson's opening statement laid out the evidence methodically. Hundreds of inappropriate messages, a pattern of isolating Iris from teammates, escalating sexual content that demonstrated clear predatory intent. He presented screenshots blown up on a projector screen, forcing jurors to read Brennan's graphic descriptions of what he wanted to do to a 14-year-old girl. Several jurors looked uncomfortable, but others maintained neutral expressions that suggested they were reserving judgment about context and intent. Gelman's opening statement was a masterclass in victim blaming without explicitly attacking Iris. He painted Brennan as a dedicated coach whose casual communication style had been misinterpreted by a teenager with a crush and her overprotective father. He suggested that Iris had initiated inappropriate conversations and that Brennan had responded unprofessionally, but not criminally. He described the case as a tragic misunderstanding that would destroy an innocent man's career and reputation based on messages taken out of context by people determined to see predatory behavior where none existed. Iris testified on day 3, and watching her on the stand was worse than anything I'd imagined. Gelman was brutal in cross-examination, asking why she'd continued conversations with Brennan if she felt uncomfortable. why she'd sent him photos, why she hadn't immediately told her parents about messages that supposedly frightened her. He questioned whether she was angry that Brennan had rejected her crush and was now punishing him with false accusations. Iris broke down crying twice, which Gelman used to suggest emotional instability that made her an unreliable witness. Detective Okafor testified about the investigation and corroborating evidence from other victims, but Gelman attacked her methodology and suggested she'd coached witnesses to align their stories. He pointed out that two families had settled civil lawsuits rather than testify, implying they'd made false accusations for financial gain. He questioned why Delilah had waited 15 years to report abuse and suggested her testimony was motivated by seeing potential settlement money from other victims' lawsuits. Dr. Kalani explained grooming psychology and how victims often felt complicit in their own abuse, but Gelman treated her testimony as theoretical rather than evidence-based. He asked whether she'd actually witnessed Brennan grooming anyone or was just interpreting messages through a lens of assumed predatory intent. He got her to admit that without physical contact, proving sexual intent was partially subjective interpretation of communication that might have multiple meanings depending on perspective. The prosecution rested after 6 days, and I felt cautiously optimistic despite Gelman's effective cross-examinations. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and surely any reasonable jury would see Brennan's messages as grooming rather than misunderstood friendliness. But Crawford warned me that reasonable doubt was a low bar in criminal cases, and Gelman only needed to convince one juror that maybe Brennan was just unprofessional rather than predatory. Brennan testified in his own defense, presenting himself as a devoted coach who'd made mistakes in maintaining professional boundaries but never intended sexual contact with students. He claimed the messages were taken out of context from longer conversations where he was providing emotional support to struggling athletes. He described Iris as a talented but emotionally needy student who'd developed an inappropriate attachment that he'd handled poorly by being too friendly rather than maintaining stricter distance. Character witnesses included Olympic coaches who praised Brennan's technical expertise and parents whose daughters had trained with him without incident. They painted a picture of a man dedicated to developing young athletes who sometimes communicated too casually but never acted inappropriately. Gelman orchestrated their testimony to suggest that the few complaints against Brennan were aberrations from troubled girls rather than patterns of predatory behavior from a serial groomer. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and each hour that passed felt like confirmation they were taking the case seriously. But when they returned with a verdict, the foreman announced not guilty on all counts. The justification in their brief statement suggested they believed Brennan had acted inappropriately, but not criminally, that his messages were unprofessional but didn't constitute solicitation. I sat frozen while Brennan hugged his attorney and his wife, while Iris sobbed beside me, while my faith in justice dissolved completely. Summit Athletics reinstated Brennan within a week of the verdict. The gym's statement praised the jury's wisdom and looked forward to Coach Brennan continuing his excellent work developing young athletes. Several families immediately re-enrolled their daughters in his training program, apparently satisfied that a not guilty verdict meant nothing had actually happened. The parents who'd supported us throughout the trial pulled their daughters from the gym in protest, but they were the minority. I filed a civil lawsuit against both Brennan and Summit Athletics for negligence and emotional distress. The burden of proof was lower in civil court, and Crawford had uncovered enough evidence of the gym's knowledge about previous complaints to suggest institutional failure to protect children. But the lawsuit would take years to resolve, and even if we won, money couldn't undo the psychological damage Brennan had inflicted on Iris and countless other girls over his career. Iris's mental health deteriorated rapidly after the verdict. The message that her testimony wasn't believed, that a jury had decided she was either lying or misunderstanding normal adult behavior, reinforced every doubt she'd struggled with about whether the abuse was real or her fault. She stopped attending therapy appointments and started spending hours alone in her room, refusing to discuss what she was feeling or how I could help. Dr. Kalani warned that post-trial trauma in sexual abuse cases often exceeded the initial victimization because it involved public invalidation of their experience. I became obsessed with tracking Brennan's activities, creating fake social media profiles to monitor his return to coaching. I watched from my car as he arrived at Summit Athletics each morning, saw teenage girls greeting him with hugs, noticed how parents treated him like nothing had happened. The rage that built in me was different from anything I'd felt during the investigation or trial. It was colder, more calculating, focused not just on what he'd done, but on the system that had protected him and would continue protecting him while destroying more children. Crawford called with information he'd uncovered through sources at Summit Athletics. Brennan had immediately resumed his pattern of isolating promising athletes and sending inappropriate messages. A 15-year-old named Autumn had shown her mother texts similar to what Iris had received, but the mother had dismissed them as misunderstandings after the not guilty verdict. Crawford had spoken with her informally, and she'd explained that suing or reporting Brennan after he'd been acquitted seemed pointless and would only hurt her daughter's training opportunities. The realization that everything would simply continue that Brennan would keep grooming, that parents would keep ignoring warnings, that the system would keep failing to protect children, created a darkness in me that I'd never experienced before. I understood intellectually why vigilante justice was wrong, why the legal system existed to prevent personal vengeance, why becoming what I'd always condemned would make me no better than the predators I despised. But I also understood that the legal system had failed completely, and more children would be destroyed while everyone pretended the jury's verdict meant Brennan was innocent. I started researching Brennan's life with an intensity that scared me. I learned his schedule, his routines, the bar he stopped at every Friday after work, the route he took home. I learned about his wife's work schedule as an emergency room nurse, the nights she worked overnight shifts, leaving Brennan alone in their house. I learned about his drinking habits, his prescription medications, his medical history of heart problems that he managed with daily pills. I was gathering information without admitting to myself what I intended to do with it. The plan formed gradually, not as a single decision, but as accumulated knowledge that created opportunities I couldn't ignore. Brennan took medication for cardiac arrhythmia, a condition that could be fatally worsened by certain drug interactions. He drank heavily on Friday nights, typically consuming enough alcohol that driving home was questionable. His wife worked 12-hour overnight shifts every Friday, leaving him alone from 7 evening until 7 morning. The variables aligned in ways that seemed to suggest what I should do, even though I'd never consciously decided to become a killer. I spent weeks researching drug interactions and cardiac complications, using medical databases I could access through my work as a pharmaceutical sales representative. I learned which substances would cause fatal arrhythmia when combined with Brennan's medication, how long symptoms would take to manifest, what the autopsy would likely conclude about cause of death. I was methodical and careful, documenting nothing in writing, using public computers and VPN services to mask my research, creating a plan that existed only in my memory. The pharmaceutical company I worked for gave me access to sample medications that I could theoretically obtain without leaving traceable evidence. The drug I needed was a common antidepressant with known cardiac side effects when combined with Brennan's arrhythmia medication. I took samples over several weeks in small quantities from multiple accounts, building a supply that wouldn't trigger inventory alerts. Each theft felt surreal, like watching someone else commit crimes I'd always believed I was incapable of contemplating. I practiced in my garage, timing how long it would take to break into a house through a standard window, how to move through rooms without leaving evidence, how to stage a scene that would look like natural death. I bought tools with cash from stores without security cameras, wore gloves constantly during practice sessions, studied crime scene investigation techniques to understand what forensics would look for. I was becoming precisely what I'd always hated, someone who believed their personal sense of justice superseded law and society's rules about civilized behavior. The night I chose was a Friday in late July when weather forecasts predicted thunderstorms that would mask noise and reduce the likelihood of witnesses noticing activity at Brennan's house. His wife had left for her hospital shift at 6:30. Brennan had gone to his usual bar at 7 and was drinking steadily based on social media posts from other patrons. I parked 3 blocks away and walked to his house through backyards, wearing dark clothes and gloves, carrying the drugs and tools I'd need in a small backpack. Breaking into his house was easier than I'd expected. The window I'd chosen was partially hidden by hedges and had an old lock that required minimal force. I was inside within 90 seconds, moving through his darkened living room toward the kitchen where I knew he kept his medication. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, but my hands were steady as I opened his pill bottles and replaced half his cardiac medication with the antidepressant samples I'd brought. The swap took less than 5 minutes. I was back in my car 12 minutes after breaking in, driving home carefully at exactly the speed limit, every nerve screaming that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'd become someone who broke into houses and tampered with medication with the intent to kill. The philosophical justification I'd constructed, that I was protecting future victims from a predator the system had failed to stop, felt hollow compared to the reality that I'd just attempted murder. Brennan died 3 days later. The news reported cardiac arrest consistent with his known heart condition, likely triggered by mixing his medication with alcohol. The autopsy would take weeks, but preliminary findings suggested natural causes exacerbated by his heavy drinking on the night he died. His obituary praised his decades of coaching excellence and the countless young athletes he'd mentored. The irony of commemorating a predator as a devoted mentor made me physically ill. I attended his funeral, compelled by some twisted need to witness the consequences of what I'd done. The service was packed with former students and their parents, many crying genuinely over losing a coach they'd loved and trusted. Several speakers praised his dedication and passion for developing young gymnasts. Nobody mentioned the trial or accusations, and I realized that in death, he'd been absolved completely. The not guilty verdict had become proof of innocence rather than just reasonable doubt. Detective Okafor approached me at the funeral, her expression unreadable. She mentioned that she'd heard about Brennan's death and wanted to check whether I was doing okay given the circumstances. Her tone suggested professional concern, but I wondered whether she suspected anything or was just performing due diligence. I expressed appropriate sadness about anyone dying tragically and excused myself before the conversation could continue. Paranoia began settling in immediately. Every police car felt like it was following me. Every phone call felt like it might be investigators asking questions. Weeks passed without any indication that Brennan's death was viewed as suspicious. The autopsy confirmed cardiac arrhythmia as cause of death, with contributing factors of alcohol consumption and poor medication compliance. The medical examiner noted that Brennan had occasionally mixed his prescriptions incorrectly based on interviews with his wife, so the presence of wrong medication in his system seemed consistent with his documented carelessness. I'd gotten away with murder through a combination of careful planning and the fact that Brennan's own negligence provided cover for what I'd done. The relief I'd expected to feel never materialized. Instead, I experienced a growing disconnection from myself, as though I was watching my life from outside my body. I went to work and had conversations and performed normal activities while feeling fundamentally separate from the person I'd been before breaking into Brennan's house. I'd believed that removing a predator would bring closure or satisfaction, but instead it had created a void where my moral certainty used to exist. Iris's condition worsened despite Brennan's death. She'd internalized the trial's outcome as confirmation that she'd been lying or crazy, and his death didn't change that fundamental damage to her self-perception. Dr. Kalani explained that justice through the legal system might have helped Iris heal by validating her experience, but vigilante justice provided no therapeutic benefit because it was invisible to the victim. I'd killed Brennan partly to protect Iris, but the act had done nothing to address the psychological wounds he'd inflicted. I started noticing other predators with the same attention I'd focused on Brennan. A teacher at Iris's school who made students uncomfortable with his touching during one-on-one tutoring sessions. A youth pastor at our church whose jokes with teenage girls had an edge that parents dismissed as friendly humor. A doctor at the clinic where I sold pharmaceuticals whose examination techniques multiple nurses had quietly complained about. I saw them everywhere suddenly, protected by the same systems that had protected Brennan, surrounded by the same willful blindness from adults who should know better. The temptation to apply my new skills to protecting other children was immediate and powerful. I had access to medications, knowledge of drug interactions, the ability to move through the world invisibly while planning. I could eliminate threats that the legal system couldn't touch, could prevent future victims by removing predators before they destroyed more lives. The rationalization was seductive. If I'd become a killer, shouldn't I at least use those capabilities to protect the vulnerable from people who'd never face legal consequences? But I also recognized the darkness in that logic, the way it justified becoming precisely what I claimed to oppose. Predators rationalized their behavior by convincing themselves they were helping their victims, that they saw things others didn't understand, that their special knowledge gave them permission to violate normal rules. I was using identical mental gymnastics to justify murder, telling myself that protecting children excused becoming a vigilante killer who appointed myself judge and executioner. The civil lawsuit against Summit Athletics was settled out of court 18 months after Brennan's death. The gym admitted no wrongdoing but paid substantial damages and agreed to implement new policies for monitoring coach-athlete communications. The settlement felt hollow. Money couldn't undo what happened to Iris, and policy changes were meaningless if adults continued ignoring warning signs because they didn't want to believe their trusted coaches were predators. I confessed to Crawford what I'd done, needing to tell someone the truth that was consuming me. He listened without judgment, then asked what I expected him to do with the information. When I said I didn't know, he explained that as a private investigator, he wasn't legally obligated to report confessions about past crimes, but that carrying this secret would destroy me eventually. He suggested therapy with someone who specialized in moral injury, the kind of psychological damage that occurred when people violated their deeply held beliefs about right and wrong. The therapist Crawford recommended was a man named Dr. Voss, who'd worked with soldiers dealing with guilt over wartime actions. He explained that moral injury differed from PTSD because it involved not just trauma, but fundamental damage to one's sense of self. I'd become what I'd always hated, someone who decided another person deserved death and took justice into my own hands. No amount of rationalization about protecting future victims could change the fact that I'd committed premeditated murder and gotten away with it. Iris was hospitalized after a suicide attempt when she was 16. The overdose was serious enough that doctors kept her in psychiatric care for 2 weeks, while stabilizing her medications and safety planning for discharge. During family therapy sessions, she talked about feeling responsible for Brennan's abuse because she hadn't recognized the grooming earlier, hadn't told me immediately when messages became inappropriate, hadn't fought harder to make the jury believe her. The trial's failure had convinced her that maybe she really had misunderstood everything, that maybe she was crazy or attention-seeking like Gelman had suggested. I wanted to tell her I'd killed Brennan, that he'd faced consequences even if the legal system had failed, that his death was justice even if it came from my hands rather than a court. But explaining what I'd done would only add to her trauma, would make her complicit in murder, would potentially expose both of us to legal consequences if she ever disclosed the information. So I stayed silent, while she blamed herself for failing to protect other girls from a predator who was already dead because of actions she knew nothing about. The investigation into Brennan's death was briefly reopened 2 years later when an anonymous tip suggested foul play. Detective Okafor interviewed me again, asking detailed questions about my whereabouts the night Brennan died and whether I'd had any contact with him after the trial. I maintained that I'd been home alone that evening and hadn't spoken to Brennan since the verdict. She seemed skeptical, but ultimately had no evidence connecting me to his death beyond motive and opportunity, which wasn't sufficient for charges. The tip had apparently come from someone at Summit Athletics who'd heard rumors that I'd threatened Brennan after the trial. I'd never actually threatened him directly, but the rumor's existence suggested people had wondered whether his death was truly natural. Okafor's questions implied she'd at least considered the possibility that I'd killed him, but without physical evidence or witnesses, the case remained closed as natural causes. I'd succeeded in getting away with murder, but the paranoia that someone would eventually discover the truth became a constant background anxiety. Iris was diagnosed with complex PTSD when she was 18, a condition that reflected not just Brennan's grooming, but the compounded trauma of the trial's failure and the years of self-blame that followed. Her therapist explained that victims often suffered more from institutional betrayal, the system's failure to protect them, than from the initial abuse. Brennan had groomed her for 6 months, but the legal system's message that her testimony wasn't credible had damaged her for years afterward. I started speaking at conferences about predator grooming and systemic failures in protecting children, using my experience with Iris's case to advocate for better policies and training. The irony of becoming an advocate for legal reform while having personally resorted to vigilante justice wasn't lost on me, but the work felt like partial atonement for becoming what I'd always condemned. If I couldn't undo killing Brennan, I could at least try preventing other families from facing similar failures that might push them towards similar darkness. Detective Okafor contacted me years later with unexpected information. New evidence had emerged suggesting Brennan had abused at least 15 girls over his coaching career, many of whom had never reported because they'd seen what happened to Iris during the trial. Several were now adults willing to discuss their experiences, and a journalist was writing an investigative piece exposing the pattern of abuse and institutional failure that had allowed Brennan to continue coaching despite multiple complaints. The article would vindicate Iris's testimony and prove that the jury's not guilty verdict had been catastrophically wrong. The vindication came too late to matter for Iris's mental health or the years she'd spent doubting her own memory and judgment. The article was published. Summit Athletics faced renewed scrutiny, and several administrators were fired for failing to act on complaints they'd documented, but never reported. But Brennan was already dead, beyond accountability, and Iris was already damaged in ways that public vindication couldn't repair. The system's failure had been exposed, but not fixed. I attended a vigil for Brennan's victims after the article was published, standing among 15 women who'd been abused by him at various points during his career. They shared stories of grooming tactics identical to what Iris had experienced, of institutions that had prioritized reputation over protection, of legal systems that had dismissed their testimony as unreliable. Several mentioned wishing someone had stopped him permanently before he could destroy more lives. I said nothing but wondered whether they'd approve of what I'd done or condemn me for becoming a murderer. Iris confronted me on her 21st birthday with a direct question about whether I'd killed Brennan. She'd spent years in therapy working through trauma and had finally reached a place where she could examine the situation analytically rather than emotionally. She'd noticed inconsistencies in the timeline of his death, had questioned why his cardiac event occurred exactly when his wife was working overnight, had wondered whether the coincidental timing suggested something other than natural causes. Her therapist had helped her recognize that she needed to know the truth to fully process what had happened. I admitted everything. The breaking and entering, the medication tampering, the premeditated murder. I explained my rationale about protecting future victims after the legal system's failure, my belief that removing Brennan was justified even if illegal. I waited for her reaction. Horror, anger, relief, disgust. But she was quiet for a long time before asking whether I thought killing him had accomplished anything beyond satisfying my need for revenge. The question cut deeper than any condemnation could have, because it forced me to acknowledge that I'd become a killer, not primarily to protect children, but because I couldn't accept that Brennan had won. She asked whether I regretted it, and I told her the truth. I regretted becoming someone capable of murder, regretted the psychological cost of carrying that secret, regretted that killing Brennan had done nothing to heal the damage he'd inflicted on her or prevent institutional failures that allowed predators to thrive. But I didn't regret that he was dead and couldn't hurt anyone else, even though that relief came at the cost of my own moral integrity. I'd become what I'd always hated, someone who decided another person deserved death, and that transformation was permanent, regardless of whether the target had deserved killing. Iris reported me to the police the next morning. She explained to Detective Okafor that she'd spent years in therapy learning about justice versus vengeance, about how vigilante actions undermined the legal system and created more trauma rather than healing it. She said she loved me and understood why I'd done what I did, but that protecting future victims required believing in institutional accountability even when institutions failed. She couldn't advocate for justice while protecting someone who'd taken justice into their own hands through murder. The confession I gave Detective Okafor was complete and detailed, including timeline, methods, and evidence she could verify. The investigation confirmed everything. Traces of the wrong medication in Brennan's autopsy samples that had been dismissed as his own error. Records of my pharmaceutical access that aligned with the drug involved. Forensic evidence from his house that suggested break-in, despite the appearance of natural death. I was charged with first-degree murder and released on bail pending trial. The case created predictable controversy. Half the community praised me as a father who'd done what the legal system couldn't, protecting children by eliminating a predator who would never face justice otherwise. The other half condemned me as a vigilante who'd undermined rule of law and become a murderer regardless of his target's guilt. Both sides used my case to argue about systemic failures, the limits of legal justice, and whether protection of children justified extra-legal violence against proven predators. I pleaded guilty rather than going to trial, accepting responsibility for premeditated murder without asking a jury to decide whether my motivations justified the crime. My attorney argued for leniency based on extreme emotional disturbance from watching the legal system fail my daughter, but the judge was clear that vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated regardless of the victim's guilt. I was sentenced to 20 years with possibility of parole after 12, considerably less than typical murder sentences, but enough to acknowledge that what I'd done was indefensible, regardless of Brennan's actions. Prison gave me time to understand what I'd become and why. I'd believed that removing a predator would bring justice and protection, but it had only created more trauma for Iris and transformed me into someone who'd violated everything I'd claimed to believe about law and morality. I'd become what I hated most, not because I was evil, but because I'd convinced myself that the ends justified the means, that protecting children gave me permission to become a killer. Every predator used similar logic to rationalize their actions, special knowledge, higher purpose, rules that didn't apply to them. I'd become what I'd opposed through identical mental gymnastics, just with different targets and justifications. Years later, Iris visited and told me she'd become an advocate for legal reform and survivor support, working to fix the systems that had failed us rather than resorting to violence outside those systems. She'd transformed her trauma into activism, choosing to believe that change was possible through persistence and institutional accountability rather than vigilante justice. She said she'd forgiven me for becoming a murderer because she understood the rage and helplessness that had driven me to it, but she couldn't excuse what I'd done because excusing it would validate the logic that justified violence when legal systems failed. Forgiveness and accountability could coexist. I served 12 years before parole, released into a world that still debated whether I was hero or villain, whether protecting children justified murder, whether vigilante justice was sometimes necessary when legal systems failed. I had no answer beyond acknowledging that I'd become what I'd always condemned, that good intentions hadn't prevented me from becoming a killer, and that protecting my daughter had required destroying myself in ways that couldn't be undone. Some transformations are permanent, some lines can't be uncrossed, and sometimes the person you hate most is the one staring back from the mirror. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.